that WPF and MVVM would not have been anywhere near as successful except for their commanding support. So I'm really excited that Silverlight's finally kind of come around to doing that. It's the last day of PDC. You guys all have your t-shirts, you have your laptops, probably even installed already all the previews and betas and SDKs that you've been hearing about. So I know the very first thing you guys are going to do when you get home is write some tests, right? Yeah? All right, I like this audience. Man, I was expecting a more negative answer. So, stunned. That's fantastic. And one of the things that I'm really going to be able to trying to do is show you how to actually write those tests easier. And even if you're not the ones writing tests, if you have QA teams, you're going to be getting on their good side because their job is going to be a lot easier too. So this slide should really kind of read at the top when testability absolutely matters. I mean, it matters all the time, right? I mean, you always kind of want to know your quality. But when your customers' requirements change, do you know if that change is actually going to break the whole rest of the product? Do you know the impact of that change? Are you going to have to make excuses, at the demo to say, oh, man, yeah, we got a crash. Or, yeah, this feature doesn't work right now. We're working on that. And finally, if you have a QA team, or even if it's just yourself, most of the time at the end of a product cycle, time is tight. You don't want to spend weeks. I mean, if you have weeks, you don't want to spend days working through all your different tests. So you want your tests to be actually run in a quick manner. And then also, you also want to be able to know at the end, yeah, we're ready. So what is testability? This is my definition for it, and it really comes around to the isolation, evaluation, and communication. Isolation, can you break your testing problem down into more manageable pieces? Evaluation, does it run fast? Can you run it often? It kind of sounds like a TDD mantra there. And then finally, communication, I think, is one that it kind of gets overlooked too much. It's the ability to, it's kind of what I was talking about the last slide. It's the ability to say, yes, I know the quality. So that you don't have to say, I don't know. I hate giving the answer, I don't know. Mostly because it means I didn't do my job. So what is the effect of testability on your tests? The big one that isn't even up here, well, if you have poor testability, you probably don't even have tests, right? So, and if you do, if you have poor testability, you're going to have so much code in there to set up the stuff. Your dependencies, maybe you're firing up services, waiting for services. You're doing all that work at the beginning. Then, since you have so much stuff there at the beginning, there's so many more points for failure. Before your test actually runs, what you're actually trying to verify, it hoses. So what we really want to be able to do is minimize all of that setup code. Because another reason, if you have all that code, how many of you guys like actually copy pasting, right? Or really trust your test method is better architected than the rest of your application just so to reduce reuse, right? So what people do, they just start cramming everything into the same test. So what you end up having is you have lots of steps and lots of different verifications. And if something fails at the beginning, the whole rest of the test doesn't even run. So what that all boils down to is you got high maintenance costs. People coming after you don't know what the test does. They don't know how to fix it. You go through and do a little bit of refactoring. You got a lot of changes to make. And finally, these types of tests are actually really slow. They just break the whole system down. So what we're going to look at is using some techniques. This stuff isn't new, but Silverlight is new. And I think people tend to kind of need to be reminded that, yeah, this stuff is still applicable and we can use it in these types of applications. So we're going to first take a look at model, view, view, model. How many people in here went to John Papa's talk last night? A handful? Okay. So John did a great job of describing model, view, view, model. I really recommend you guys looking at the on-demand cast of that. One of the other things that he focused on was a technology called Prism. He called it a tool set. It's put out by our patterns and practices team. And Prism is a fantastic tool that uses the concepts of MVVM to make your application not just testable, but also modular, extensible. And that brings me to another idea. When you're talking about improving your applications for testability, you're going to get way more benefits, right? It's going to be better architected. It's going to be more modular. It's going to be more extensible. So let's dive in. So model view, view model. People say, oh, it's something new, but it isn't. It's MVC, model view controller, is there before. But it's actually even closer to Martin Fowler's presentation framework. And the concept of data binding is something that really caused Fowler's approach to really take a long time to build on, because building that logic to bind the view to the model is actually really expensive. If you've ever tried to do it on your own, well, I'm glad that we have our stuff now so you can throw your code all away. And so with WPF's approach and Silverlight's approach, it's very dependent on data binding, and that's what makes it successful. And not to mention, when you use data binding and you actually split your view from your view model and your model, you're actually enabling designers or third-party people that you guys hire to come in and make your apps look way better to actually do their job more effectively and efficiently. So let's take a quick look at the pattern, just the high-level picture. We're going to start at the top down here. The view. The view is actually pretty easy to explain. It's a thing you get to see on the screen. You can point at it. You can click on it. A big thing, like I was just talking about, to enable designers to work with it, we try to define as much of it declaratively as possible. It allows them to use their tool set, like Blend, to do their job. But some things you just can't do declaratively. It's OK to have code behind. I think Glenn Block even said in a blog, moving to model view view model is not a line counting exercise. It's not, hey, let's get rid of all of the code and the code behind. But if you do have it there, you want to be aware of what you're doing, right? You want to keep it thin, because the more code you have there, the more difficult a designer can do their job. And the thing is, the view is the hardest thing of the whole setup to test. And so the more code that you have there, the more testing you have to do. The view model, it's the meat. It's the stuff inside. It's what drives the model. It shapes the data so that the model can bind to it. It exposes those data points. A good way to think about it is that it can expose one data point, expose multiple data points, collections of data points. That's where you really can enter into the hierarchy of data. And the key thing here is, even though it has the word view in it, it should not actually contain UI. Your view model should not have a property that returns a button. And finally, the model, simply data. As simple as you can get, as tiny, as ignorant of everything else around it. That's what you want your model to be. Now, the line between model and view model has really started to blur because, well, let me give you an example. A few months ago, a well-respected leader in the development community came to Microsoft, and he was demoing his application, and it's pretty whiz-bang. Halfway through, all of a sudden, a couple of the pages didn't load. He clicked on a button, and the browser crashed, and he was apologizing and saying, oh, this is our latest build, and I was like, well, don't you guys do any testing? And his answer was no. They know that you should do it. I mean, he's probably been to a couple talks like this or read a few blogs. But the thing that he had this perception is that you have your model. And he thought that for every type in your model, you actually had to wrap it with a whole other view model. So that doubles your types, doubles your maintenance. And so one of the things I was going to talk about, that blurring between the model and the view model, is that your model can actually have something to its shape that actually kind of behaves a little bit like the view model. For example, it might implement iNotify property changed, or iNotify collection changed. All these things that are very powerful for data binding, so you don't need to wrap it anymore. The cases where you would want to wrap it, it's stuff where you're really adding value to it that's very specific to the view that you're actually binding to. So besides the layering with model view view model, there's also the concept of inversion of control. Again, this is nothing new. And in fact, the easiest, simplest solution is something that I think we've been all learning since CS 101. Just simply by passing your dependencies into the constructor, you're able to decouple your implementation from the dependency. So one thing that's really interesting here, or actually it's just necessary, is you notice that I'm changing from using an actual bar implementation to actually the iBar interface. And this is really important so that you also decouple from the implementation. You're still coupled to the iBar interface, but that's fine. The thing is, we have something even better. And actually, it's something that you use in conjunction with that last approach. And that's the concept of dependency injection and dependency injection containers. There's several of these out there. It's been around. It's there for the desktop, lots of different options. There's community options for Silverlight. At Microsoft, we have two that we're really kind of building on. One is Unity. John Papa talked about that last night. Unity is the dependency injection framework for Prism. We also have MEF. I don't know if anybody in here came from Glenn Block's talk just prior, a couple of you. Standard Microsoft thing. Why do one when you can do two, right? But there's actually a very definitive way, kind of to think of MEF versus Unity. MEF is all about extensibility. It can do the other stuff, but its wheelhouse is extensibility. So if you're looking at extensible, wanting to create an extensible app, I really suggest looking at MEF, going back, checking out Glenn's webcast. So can't really talk about it much more without just starting to show it. So let's switch over and take a look at an application. All right, well, I'm a sports fan, and when I started pulling this, the concepts together, it was like the perfect storm of sports. You had baseball ending, basketball beginning, you're in the middle of football season, hockey's fired up and going, everything's happening. What's one thing that all sports fans do? You play fantasy sports. You go in, you're picking your players, you're talking trash to your friends. Well, it's like, you know what? There's other stuff to do. It's all about data, right? I mean, the really best guys are the ones with all the spreadsheets. So what else has data? Well, you know what? Welcome to fantasy presenting. So I have already created a team. So in it, on my team, I've got Scott Guthrie. I've got myself. Don't think Mark Sanchez doesn't play himself every week. And a couple other guys of RIA Services. Brad, you probably may have just heard, and Dinesh Kulkarni is after me here. And then, it's just a kind of general concept. Looks like we're scrolled off the screen a little bit. No scroll bar. But, it's just kind of an exciting idea. So let's go back. You can also go back to home. You can create a new team, give it a team name, pick from here. So the thing is this. In this application, you don't know where this data comes from, right? So what we're really going to look at is how, from the first perspective, how you're actually going to be able to test the view and really use those view model concepts. So let's take a quick look at how the application is built out. What we have, let's ignore the back end for a little bit. Let's focus on the front part. What we have is we have 3 data models, or view models set up in here. Let's take a quick look at the user view model. The user view model, if you notice, I have actually an interface set up for it. It has the concept of an authenticated user. It has the teams for that specific user. And it has several commands to actually respond to the stuff on the screen, all my interactions. So, let's go and take a look then at, one of the views. So that home view binds to this concept of the user view model, but it's stored in the static resource. I'll show you where we get that from in a minute. But then the other thing, let's take a look at the code behind. Nothing there. Look, Ma, no hands. None of these guys have code behind. And so I've actually been able to really separate and declaratively define the view versus the view model. So let's take a look at a test for that. So this test actually is using the Silverlight unit testing framework that Jeff Wilcox put together. It's been around since Silverlight 2. It's going through some current revisions. I think if you check out the Silverlight toolkit page or Jeff Wilcox's page here pretty soon, you'll see some cool new things. It looks just like a VSTS test. You've got your test class, you've got your test method. One thing that's interesting is that it derives from Silverlight test. And this is important for testing the view because the Silverlight test provides an actual canvas, a panel that you can actually draw your view on and interact with. And this is necessary for Silverlight because a lot of the things can't happen until your view, the control, is actually part of the visual tree. It doesn't get resized, and it doesn't respond to events, animations don't start. Lots of stuff that's really important to your view is all depending on actually being shown. So let's take a quick peek at kind of what the test is doing. So one of the things with Microsoft and Silverlight and views is we're really trying to kind of get rid of the notion of kind of blocking the UI when something's going on. We're really trying to kind of keep everything asynchronous so that, and it's up to the developer to kind of hide the pieces of the UI that should still be unusable until the data finishes loading, et cetera. So one of the things is, we have the loaded event handler, loaded event for the control. And so this view has a loaded. And the thing is, as I was just saying, I can't actually use anything of the view until it's loaded. So what we actually end up having, this is kind of unique to the Silverlight unit test framework, is this concept of an asynchronous test. And an asynchronous test allows you to set things up and then block the test until an asynchronous event is finished. And so, for example, I'll show you here. On the loaded, we actually set this flag, home view loaded, to true. And so later, when this test executes, the test actually does not continue until home view loaded equals true. And so we've essentially blocked the test there until the canvas is finished loading. A little later, the next step is, once that happens, you end up queuing up a callback. And as the names imply here, it's building up a queue. And then the asynchronous attribute at the top of the test says, OK, listen, you're going to exit out of your test body really quick. But the test really isn't over until you're done processing all of the items in the queue. And so one thing I just want to call out now, make sure that you always end with enqueue test complete. It's a really easy mistake to make, but it's necessary so that your tests continue to run. It'll run everything up to that point. Finally, I want to kind of show you something here. So this is, the test itself is actually trying to mimic hey, I'm actually clicking the add a new item button. I want to make sure that that command binding is set up. I'm able to click through to it. So your actual test, you actually want to try and click the button. Well, there's a couple ways to do that, but there's really only one way to do it automatically out of the box with Silverlight, and that's actually through the UI automation accessibility APIs. Has anybody here worked with kind of accessibility APIs before? Maybe implemented iAccessibility on old Windows stuff? Anybody playing with UI automation at all? Yeah? All right. Kind of same folks. UI automation is the successor to iAccessibility. Came about with WPF, and Silverlight has adopted it for its accessibility support. When I say accessibility, I'm talking about if you have a screen reader, like Narrator in Windows, hovered over a button, the computer will actually read out saying, you are over button foo. Those same interfaces and APIs can actually be reused to actually drive the UI through testing. So let's see what we do here. So we find the button by just kind of using the standard, hey, here's my parent. Go find a child with the name of new team button. Then say from that button, I want you to create a new button automation peer. Microsoft has to implement automation peers for all of our controls that we ship out of the box. The button automation peer implements an interface called the IInvoke pattern, or rather the IInvoke provider. And so from this automation peer, you can call get pattern, pass in, say, I want the invoke pattern, and it'll return it back. Now I should probably do some, this actually returns null if it's not there, so I should probably be doing some extra checking. But finally, the call to invoke pattern.invoke goes through, doesn't actually do a mouse message through the Windows system, but programmatically invokes either the click handler or the command if you have a command bound to that button. Finally, after those steps, well, wait a minute, here's another in-queue conditional. What's happening here? This is the one downside to using UI automation, is that it is actually asynchronous itself. So we have another blocking point. So we actually have to wait for it. Now, in this case, I'm waiting for something in the view model to change. Well, that's pretty dependent on the view model. But didn't we talk about trying to layer and not have those dependencies all the way down? I mean, if an implementation changes in the view model, I don't want to have to go through and rewrite a test for the view, right? So we're going to take a look at how to actually fix this up a little bit to kind of get rid of that dependency. So first I want to show you, well, one, that it actually runs in the first place. So let's come down here. Set that as a start page. So Silverlight unit tests run in the browser. And so we launch a browser window. They execute. On the left-hand side of the page is where, you saw the UI flick up. That's the panel where we draw the UI. What? All right. Right, so I just wrote a test for the view. But now it's talking about something about RIA domain operation, loading failure. What does that have to do with the view, right? Nothing. So try and figure out what's going on here. So if we go back up to the test and we take a look, we're creating just a standard vanilla user view model. But if you go and take a look at that user view model, inside of its constructor, we're going off and we're getting data from behind the scenes. Because as far as this view model is concerned, it's hooked up, it's ready to go, it needs all that stuff. So what we're going to do is really kind of use the power of the architecture that we set up. And instead of passing in an actual user view model into that view test, we're going to be passing in an iUser view model. And that's easily done just by kind of creating a class and implementing the iUser view model interface. So why don't we just go in and tackle that? Let's go here to our test project and add a new class. Honk if you like testing. Fake user view model. All right. So let's go in and let's have this inherit from iUser view model. Use a couple of shortcuts to implement that interface. So it's all there. Now, this might be a good spot to use mocking if you use mocking frameworks. I myself kind of tend to like using more fakes, like just standard test doubles. Mostly because I've gotten burned too many times when it comes to refactoring. All of a sudden, all your mocks are invalidated, especially if they're using strings to kind of identify the different methods and stuff they're doing. But if you like using mocks and you've had success with them, or you have a particular framework you enjoy, here's a perfect place to do that. So instead, we're just going to do a quick implementation on this. Now, how do I, before with the other view model, I was checking to see if the new team actually showed up as is non-null, as knowing if that thing succeeded. So let's actually instead go in, and we're going to actually add a new event to this guy. It's actually going to just let us know when an A command got invoked. So we'll come in, we'll add a quick handler here, kind of the standard pattern. Oh, and then actually you need to add the event in the first place. So we'll set up the model. And I pasted that into the wrong part. All right, here we go. So it's simple. Got an event on the top, command invoked. Inside the constructor, I've created an action command. Here's one of the annoying things about commands. It's an interface, so you actually have to have an implementation of that. Some people go and actually create classes. I don't know. John Papa showed with Prism what they had a delegate command, essentially using delegates to actually implement it behind the scenes for you. I kind of quickly made an action command that uses actions. The first parameter is the action that you're actually going to call. So in this case, when the add new team command gets called, I actually just want to raise a new command invoked event with the name of the command. In true, the second option is something that's used to it's for the can invoke. Or this is good for kind of controlling the enabled look of buttons. So very simple there. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, well, the thing is our view actually depends on more than just calling that command. So what we need to do is implement a couple more things to just not throw implemented exceptions. So we'll just say return new user. I'm already kind of using a hard-coded user for the demonstration purposes here. For this guy, we're going to return new page collection view. I love dev10s. You just kind of start typing, and it shows you everything in IntelliSense, even if you didn't actually type it in the right order. And we'll just do a new list of object. And then, all right. And it doesn't like it because I don't have a namespace in there yet. OK. So, and that, oh, actually, we actually need to hook up the command. So it's down here on the add new team command. We're going to return this dot add new team command. OK. So now we've got this mocked up interface, or this implementation. Let's actually use it. So here we are in our home view tests. Let's go, I'm just going to comment out the test method, so that keeps it from running. And we're going to pull down another test here. And here's a better test. That's the one I'm looking for. So this one looks really similar. Fortunately, we can't get rid of the synchronicity or the timeout because you're still needing the UI to draw, and you need to give everything back there. But what we can do is here, I've created my fake user view model. I am actually signing up for that command invoked event. And in it, I'm actually setting the command invoked flag to true. Down here at the bottom, we're going to be blocking to make sure, wait until that's done. Still the same code to actually invoke the command and fire that up. Now, one of the other things is, if the command invoked is true, then the test passed, right? Everything got hooked up. But I don't like tests that don't have assertions in them. It just feels bad. And so even though it might come off as a little redundant, I still really recommend adding in, every test should have some sort of assertion, even if it is true of true. So let's go in and fire this guy up. All right. Works, ran fast. So let's kind of get back to the other kind of part of it. And this is, once you get into kind of working with real services, it becomes a lot more difficult. Real quick, so the Silverlight unit test framework, a couple of notes. It ships with the Silverlight toolkit. There's a lot of cool things in the Silverlight toolkit if you haven't gone and taken a look at that. Its APIs, as we saw, were nearly identical to VS unit tests. Now, there are actually a couple differences. One is tags. Tags is the way to actually filter tests at runtime. And the other thing is this asynchronous execution, which we looked at already. A couple of other notes on the asynchronous stuff. Test execution is always on the UI thread with the Silverlight unit testing. The problem is a lot of stuff, even besides just UI, is on the UI thread. The Silverlight's whole networking stack is on the UI thread. So if you're making a networking request, you can't block the UI thread in your test waiting for that networking request to come back. Asynchronous enables those scenarios, but the thing is asynchronous tests are slow. I'll tell you why. So remember that queue that you're building up? Well, the way that the test harness actually goes through and executes that queue, it just can't right through the whole thing. It actually it throttles it. And it throttles it with the dispatcher timer set at, I think it's at 500 milliseconds. So you start doing the math, and for every one of those in-queue operations that you do, you're going to be tacking on more time to your test. So they're slow. What that means is you really want to limit those. It's a whole other reason to kind of keep that view layer really thin. So other stuff actually needs asynchronous support. And that's, as I was saying, making network calls, network requests. stuff you're doing to go back out and get the data. So the thing is, .NET RIA Services is a great framework for actually getting that information from your server to your client. How many in here were actually at Brad's talk? Just before this? OK. RIA Services, as I was saying, is the great way to get your data from the server to the client. You write your logic in one place, your business logic. You write your validation logic in one place. You create your data model in one place. And then RIA Services uses its tooling to actually generate client types for you that in your client code, in your Silverlight code, you can instantiate and call and load. And the full communication between the two tiers is completely handled for you. So kind of just a quick high-level peek at it. Everything in blue is something that RIA Services adds to it. This is a standard N-tier application. You've got your database all the way over on the left. You have a mid-tier in the middle with your domain model. What's a domain model? So domain model, in my terms, is in your database you have tons of tables. You've got lots of fields in those tables. But for most of your applications, you don't actually pull down all of those. You're pulling down just the tables, just the columns that are important to solve that specific problem, right? Think about a credit card company. They're not going to give, they're going to give a different domain model for the card holders being able to pay their accounts and the actual point of sale inserting all the card charges. So all that stuff kind of gets wrapped up in the domain model. You can add your validation in there. As I said, that stuff gets moved into the client through code generation. On the client, the stuff that gets built there are data bindable entities and data context. Before, remember I was saying how you kind of don't want to go and just add a whole bunch of extra layers in between your types, in between your model and your view model. The nice thing is RIA Services creates types, creates entities that you can bind to directly from your view. The communication between the tiers is done with a pairing of the data client and the data service. So the thing is, how do we test this? Well, we can actually draw the lines kind of exactly where you'd expect them. So we already have the split that we talked about between the view and the view model. But now we can actually split at that data client, data service pairing. And we're going to take a quick look at that. And also, Entity Framework has done a fantastic job in their latest version of improving testability. Did anybody in here go to that talk? The ADO.NET talk? OK, that one, if you're doing anything with data, I would really recommend going back to that webcast or the on-demand and really taking a look at it. But I'm still going to show you kind of how to use a few of those techniques. So let's dive in again. Now we're going to pay a little more attention to the web application, the server side. What we have in here is a domain service. And in this domain service, it has a few query events, saying, hey, this is the stuff that needs to get called to load the events from the database, to load the leagues, the presenters, everything like that. ADO.NET also has, or Entity Framework rather, has support to actually delay load and also not actually, and actually be able to load, hey, I have my presenter. Go and actually get also, at the same time I load presenters, all of that presenter's presenter histories. Or maybe a more traditional thing, if you have an order, go and load all that order's order details. And you can go all the way down to saying, give me the order details and back to the products and the full stack all in one. It's really nice to get the information you want loaded at the right time. Another key part of RIA Services is the concept of the metadata. And this is a way to add validation that's specific to your domain. You say, hey, every single product should have, it's required to actually have, a product ID, other stuff. You can add that sort of validation in this file. So what I really want to show is how we can actually break this up on the client. Because remember how we broke off at the view, we implemented a fake view model. Well, the next thing you want to be able to do to be able to abstract out that next layer down is to break off that communication between the data client and the data service. So let's come up here. Now let's take a quick look at one of my implementations up here. So I have this concept of the iData gateway. It's just an interface. It's a place for me, for my application, to hold an instance of the domain context for the life of the application. So in here, it just returns the domain context. A very simple interface. But what we can do, oops. Is in our test over here, we can actually put in a mock domain or mock data service. And so we can actually test the view model without going through all the layers and all the way down. So let's take a quick look at doing that. To do it, I am going to actually include some files that I've already written, just save you guys from my typing. So if you notice in here, this is my in-memory data gateway. It's something I've implemented. But when I knew up my domain context, I'm actually passing in this in-memory domain client. Now what's that? So let's take a quick look at that file. Now this is simply something that implements or that inherits from local domain client. Now local domain client is actually something that Nikhil Kotari wrote in one of his blog posts to kind of show how to do this. I updated it for the later or more newer versions of RIA services. So the only thing you have to do is actually take a look and say, oh, for each query name, actually return the set of objects. Now, this in-memory data, this is just a simple class, returns a few lists of data, something that you can change, you can add to over time, however you like. Reuse in different tests. Now, what we need to do is let's add a new class. Let's create some new tests. So this is going to be user view model tests. And in here, we are going to actually just drag this over, add some namespaces. All right. Okay. So now that test looks a lot cleaner. You know, you're just testing the view model. And what we're able to do is, for this data gateway, we're going to instantiate an in-memory data gateway. We're going to go and we're going to just reuse the standard navigation view model. There's no reason to mock it out. It's a really simple view model. Now we're going to pass those into the constructor for the user view model using that inversion of control. Execute the command, and this, as opposed to that invoke for the button, this is actually synchronous. So we can go and check those values right away. So what we can do is now, oh, you know, another thing, I don't know if you guys noticed this before, but when I ran that first set of tests, I was running it from inside of a web page that's loaded up on the web server. Just to show you that we've really broken that tie there, I'm actually going to change the startup project to be this test. And this is just going to load a file from my standard, just from your disk. And Silverlight normally doesn't like that, or Silverlight loves it. RIA Services doesn't like it, because it likes HTTP stuff. And my test ran. Oh, actually, what happened here? Looks like the Silverlight unit test stuff is starting to render stuff a little differently. Oh, I know what I didn't do. Forgot to add test class, this guy. All right, there we go. This is going to run. Now, I think we're going to get different results. I don't think it's going to lay out any differently. Oh, that's all I had to do. All right, so as you can see, it ran through. Now, the next thing, and this is kind of the final thing that we're really going to try and show in getting that split, is, as I was saying, the split between the domain context and your database on the back end. Now, this one, that's pretty tricky. In fact, it was very difficult, if at all possible, to do with the prior version of Entity Framework. What you'd end up having to doing is to change your domain service all around, like the whole way that you change it. But with the new version of Entity Framework, we can do a couple tweaks to the project, add some code that's kind of boilerplate that you can add to any one of your projects and actually enable it. So what we're going to do is come in here. I'm going to add another project to my solution. dive on in. So I called it the persistent strategy. You know, every pattern has its name, and everybody kind of takes their own liberties with how they use each of those patterns. I think it's a strategy because, let me show you really quickly the interface. It's a way, you know, I actually first wrote this up as having 5 different interfaces, and each one is named, it's an adapter, it's a factory, and all that stuff. But for me, it's really the collection of all of them that actually makes doing this possible. And so that's why I combined them all into a strategy. Now, all right, so I just added a project. Now, how do you actually get that actually used by your code? So what we can do is come into our web project. Let's add our reference to this project that we just added. Now, one of the things the Entity Framework enabled was the ability to actually change the code that they generate for you from your model by using T4 templating. And so that's what we did. So what we can do here is I'm just going to expand this. We're going to add this TT model into our project. Now this template is not specific to just this project. You can actually take this template and apply it to any one of your projects if you use the persistent strategy approach. The one thing that you would have to change is this setting right here to point to your EDMX file. So what we do in this is we actually change the data model that gets produced to actually use Unity to go out and discover our iPersistent strategy implementations. And I'm going to show you real quickly kind of how that's done. So what we're using is we're doing it with XML configuration. So inside of your web.config, if you scroll down here, you can see I have an iPersistent strategy. I'm actually going to say when Unity is asking for that iPersistent strategy, I want you to give it the data store persistent strategy. Very simple, easy to do, easy to have in your web.config. So once we break out of that, let's come back here and let's actually add a test. Actually, no, before we add a test, I want to show you that this thing actually runs. So your existing, even though we changed everything there behind the scenes, we're coming back over. Now, wait a minute, what's going on here? Oh, here's the other step that you need to do. In your data model, you actually need to come back over to your properties and tell its code generation strategy, not the default, set it to none. I was generating 2 sets of entities and stuff. I'm going to wave my hands here for a minute. Here's one of the things in RIA services, the current way it's produced, we use an attach as modified extension method. Right now, that doesn't work with the iObjectSet interface, which is the really big extensibility, or it's extensibility, the testability mechanism inside of Entity Framework. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to say, I need to include my persistent strategy. Because in my persistent strategy namespace, there's an extension method for include for object sets. So down here, we have our attaches modified. I'm just going to go in here really quick and say, OK, instead of running that on the object context, do it on the object set. We're going to do the same thing up here for this update for presenter team mappings. All right. So let's come in here. Let's get our startup project back to here. I think we're pretty tight on time, so I'm just going to go straight into adding the test. We're going to change our startup page to be the application there. And we're going to add an existing project. I've already kind of brought up, and this is just a VSTS test, standard test project that you can create with Visual Studio. In here. So what we've got is we have our domain service tests. Oh, I need to add my project reference to persistent strategy to kind of get all that stuff to compile. Now in here, I'm just instantiating this domain service. But all of a sudden, wait, how do I actually get the right stuff in there? Well, the thing is, inside of your solution, inside of this test project, we actually have our own app.config. And in this app.config, I can actually specify, since, for the unit test's sake, what implementations of the interfaces I actually want to use in each case. So let's real quick pop back out. Let's build everything. I love it when everything compiles successfully. We're going to pick both of these guys, and we're just going to show the test running. And it doesn't actually go out to the database. It actually loads it in. Not sure why that failed. You can come up afterwards and talk to me about it a little bit. Let's pop back real quick. Let me start wrapping up. So testing the view, we already took a quick look at how we use UI automation. We kind of hijacked it to kind of get our stuff. However, that's a way to do it. You still want to test real user interactions. So you want to be able to, for testing a view, actually send your mouse clicks, send your keyboard presses. The problem is, those types of tests are not quite as reliable. So the way that we try and do it at Microsoft is, even within that view layer, we break down the number of tests that really need to use those mouse and keyboard interactions, reduce those to a minimal set, so that the rest of the coverage we can do programmatically. A final kind of approach is to actually have a bridge plugin that installs into your browser. It actually has access to the Silverlight host, can kind of get some internal data, and also it runs out, has an out-of-browser concept to be able to actually do those mouse events. So what's left to test? Make sure you do your end-to-end. You break everything up. You got to put them back together. Globalization is important. Silverlight 4, we had a lot of support for the rich text area, international text all over the place, right to left. Incorporate those into your applications. One thing that's been there all along, if you start using parse, make sure that you parse with the invariant current culture. That way, if it's a comma or a dot, like in a double, you don't get a parse error. Security, performance, stress, those are all things, for some other talk, they're huge, but they're very important to make sure that you handle. So call to action, go home, write those tests like you told me you were going to, show off what you learned, use the inversion of control, model view view model. Use RIA services to actually transport your data, because as I've shown, you're able to actually break at those communication points and actually mock out your database, mock out the server, and actually test your data-related code. Finally, resources. There's a slew of talks. Brad Abrams did a talk right before this. Dinesh Kulkarni is up next. And my blog is msdn.blogs.com, or blogs.msdn.com/KeithJones. Over the course of the next few days, I'll be adding more details here, some more references to other blogs out in the community for people to look at. In the meantime, go to Bing, search for MVVM, Silverlight. There's tons of information out there. Finally, the Silverlight toolkit's where you go to get the unit testing framework and lots of other cool controls and support that they've added. So, thank you for all of your attention. And if you have any questions, you can meet me outside. Actually, I'm going to be at the Silverlight booth in the product room, so meet me there. Or go ahead and listen to Dinesh Kulkarni's talk, the deep dive into RIA services. I'll be at the booth for a while, and when Dinesh comes back, you can follow him over and talk to me. Please submit your feedback. It goes to help out a great charity. Thank you, guys.